Hi everyone, this is Nuno from Sound Particles, and it's a pleasure to be here today to present you the last video on this series on how to program a synth. Today we're going to talk about spatial, but don't go away, okay? Yes, most likely you only work with stereo, but this is very important also for stereo users because otherwise you may be creating presets in mono. Nowadays everyone uses stereo synthesizer, okay, either as a virtual instrument or a keyboard, okay, but you need to be careful because if you don't think about the stereo aspect of things, you end up creating a mono preset. When you create a sound with your synthesizer, you use oscillators. Oscillators are mono oscillators. They create one channel of audio. And there is two ways that most synthesizers create the stereo output. One of them is by panning each oscillator. You could say, I want oscillator 1 to come from the left side, and I want oscillator 2 to come from the right side. And by doing this, okay, when you play something, yes, different oscillators are coming from different parts of your sound image, and by doing this, okay, now you have this stereo image coming out of the synth. Like I mentioned, if you don't do something like that, most likely all oscillators comes from the center and you get this mono coming out. So on a synthesizer, most cases what you're going to have is a knob to control the panning of each oscillator, oscillator 1, left or right. In SkyDust, since we support also 3D, it's a little more fancy, okay? But imagine that you say oscillator 1 comes to the left and oscillator 2 comes to the right. And by doing this, you start creating some stereo imaging. Some synthesizers also allow you to create some randomness on each note, which means that imagine that you say, okay, I want oscillator 1 to come more from the left side, but every time that you play a different note, I want the position to slightly change. So for instance, if I put this in here, so as you can see, you get this oscillator 1 coming from there, but now I can add some randomness, okay, and you start having oscillator 2 coming with different positions. And now I want oscillator 2 that is over there, okay, also with some randomness, and by doing this, okay, I'm going to start having this sound image much more interesting than simply having a mono coming out. So panning oscillators, it's one way of creating this stereo image. The second way of doing this, it's using effects, okay? So most synths already have some built-in effects. Yes, you could have much more powerful effects like in delay and other delays and reverbs and things like that, but the idea or the good thing about having effects within the synthesizer is that you can have effects associated with that preset. You say, okay, this is the delay effect that I want with this preset, but if I change preset now, I'm going to have different kind of effects. The second way of creating the stereo image is using effects. Every time that you use things like reverbs or delays, well, that creates some stereo effects coming out. You play something, yes, the oscillators may even be on the center, but simply by adding some reverb, now the sound comes from the center, but some reflections comes from the left and the right, or eventually with delay. You could say, I have oscillator here, but I want the delay coming on the other channel, and by doing this, you create this randomness and much more interesting effect in terms of spatial and much more life into your preset. Well, also, one other thing that you can do is start using other components like LFOs or even envelope generators to control the spatial aspect. Imagine something like this. Imagine that you say, okay, I want, when I play something, I want oscillator 1 to start in the left, but moving to the right. And I want oscillator 2 to be at the center and oscillator 3 to be, for instance, on the right, and then attacks to the left side. So you can control all of those things, or eventually using an LFO and say, I want oscillator 1, but I want oscillator 1 to simply start moving one way and the other, and almost like an auto panner moving around. And there are multiple ways of doing this. In case of SkyDust, you have these built-in LFOs and envelope generators that you control directly the position of the oscillators. So in this case, what I'm having here, it's oscillator 1 as this LFO controlling the elevation or the azimuth or something like that. Well, if you have a more basic synthesizer, you can still do all these sort of things with matrix. You can come to your matrix and say, okay, I'm going to my matrix, but now what I want is to use LFO 1 to control, for instance, the panning of something in terms of the position of the oscillators. So by having LFOs controlling the panning of oscillators, you can create much more interesting effects. Or instead of LFOs, you can use envelope generators and say, okay, now what I want to do is I'm using an envelope generator, and this is going to control the panning of oscillator 1 or panning of oscillator 2. Once again, this brings a completely new level in terms of spatial and movement and life. Okay, you could choose to do some micro movements and simply move things very slowly just to get this life coming out of things, or you can create some crazy effects. Now it's up to you and the kind of things that you want to do with your preset. Finally, some synthesizers may eventually allow you to use a sequencer, okay, where you create your arpeggios, okay, but since you can add some additional parameters, imagine now that you control also the panner of the oscillator here, which means that you are playing a note, that note are creating these sequences, but what you want to do is to make sure that each note, the oscillator is jumping from speaker to speaker or jumping from position to position in terms of the sound image. And by doing this, once again, arpeggios moving around, much more interesting than having arpeggios static or even in mono. So once again, don't forget about spatial, even if you are only using stereo. Multiple ways you can pan the oscillators with or without randomness. Yes, you can use effects to control things like delays, reverbs, things like that, but then you can even go crazier and do very interesting things with using LFOs, envelope generators, controlling those panning parameters. And with all of that, you create this preset that is much more interesting, with much more life, okay, coming out of your performance. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this series of videos on how to program a synth. I hope that now you are able to take a few hours, go to your favorite synth and start playing the sounds and the presets, because besides composing the notes and orchestration or instrumentation, all sorts of things, also creating the sound can be a very, very interesting creative task for you. And once again, don't forget to subscribe to our videos, and let's see you on some other video in some time. Bye.